Welcome, everyone. Welcome to this very exciting occasion. My name is Ellie Demarchelier, and this is the launch of the inaugural Australian Disability Dialogue Project, our dialogue on housing. Just a quick note to say that we are recording today's event. So if you'd prefer not to be recorded, please be sure to keep your camera off, although we really do encourage you to keep your camera on if you feel comfortable, so that we can feel like we're in this community today, coming together in the same room, even though we're joining each other from different corners of the country. I also encourage you to use the chat function to ask questions or make comments. The dialogue has been established to create a space outside of government where people with disability and those from services and support and those who are our allies can share ideas and perspectives and grapple with the big ideas in a safe and collaborative environment. Over the past month, we've run a series of interactive events that have tapped into the wisdom and insight of people with disability to really think outside the box. Today, we are going to take you through that project and unveil some of those ideas that have been generated. We will be joined by Minister Shorten in just a few minutes, but before we get started, I would like to acknowledge that I join you for the lands of the Yagara and Turrbal people and pay my respects to their elders, past and present, and also acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded. We are entering a really important moment in our nation's history with the upcoming referendum on an Indigenous voice to Parliament. It's critical we all brief ourselves on the invitation that First Nation leaders have issued us. I'm excited to be announcing today that the dialogue will be partnering with the First Peoples Disability Network and the broader sector to convene a Disability for Yes briefing on September 13. So keep your eyes out for an invitation to that event and details of some of the work that the sector will be playing and to make the Uluru Statement more accessible to all Australians. That's some really exciting work coming up. Now, back to the Australian Disability Dialogue. This has been a really unique process that has been led by people with disability. One of the first things we did was to identify a defining question for this project. And we took the challenge laid down by the NDIS Reviews report back to frame our discussion. How can housing and living supply responses be encouraged to be more innovative and aligned with participant needs? The design process we came up with was to firstly start with an agreed set of facts, which was embodied in Todd's discussion paper, which you'll hear a little bit about in a moment. Secondly, we ran a series of focused discussions with groups of people with disability, providers, and allies invited to share their ideas. Then, to bring these ideas together, to listen to, interrogate, and test each other's ideas. And now today's final report, where we hand these ideas over to the review and to the minister. Underpinning this process the entire time has been our 4 design principles, which we call the 4 Cs. Choice, living models that advance choice and control. Change, workforces and programs that build agency and independence. Community, genuine support with accessible communities. Cost benefit, matching supply and demand. These were really useful anchor points in shaping our discussion and ensuring the ideas we generated were consistent with agreed underlying principles. I think the quality and ideas we are unveiling today are a direct result of the robust process we undertook. But before we unveil those ideas, I'd like to introduce Todd Winther, academic and consultant who had the job of building that base of agreed facts to talk us through his discussion paper. Todd?
Thanks, Ellie. The way we started this project was to place disability housing in the broader context of a broken system. The system is so complex that it's sometimes easy to get lost, but the bottom line is the system doesn't work for many Australians, especially those with a disability. One of our early discussions was influenced by Jamie from Inclusion Australia, who encouraged us to think about explaining the system visually, free of jargon. It meant I had to rewrite my very academic discussion paper and work with our designers to bring the ecosystem to life. What we came up with was this: a graduated system where, a graduated system where we acknowledged that the housing system is in crisis on one end and has an abundance of housing at the other. A system where a basic human need is also the key anchor of economic security, and a system where it seems that there are more supports for people with existing property assets than those that are in crisis. People with a disability, whether they're in the NDIS or not, have to navigate the system, and they are more likely to be in crisis or in supported housing. We then looked at the role of the NDIS and other government supports. One of the things that really stood out to us is the relatively small number of people on the NDIS. Taking all these on board, we set out to create a roadmap to imagine a better system. We identified 6 different areas where we would ask our dialogue participants to turn their minds and facilitate new ideas. First one is genuine voice. That was our first challenge, to imagine better ways of giving people with disability a genuine say in how they live. Community connections. The providers group was asked to think about ways of bringing support for people with disability into the broader community. Third, we wanted to create models that people want. So we asked the disability group to develop models that better reflected our life cycles. Freeing up land. Fourth, our allies group considered innovative ways to free up land to support new and innovative models of housing. Fifth, economic independence, where the provided group imagined models to build economic independence for people with disabilities. Finally, genuine inclusion, where our allies group was asked to imagine markets that could deliver genuine inclusion for people with disabilities into the broader community. Each of these design challenges was discussed by one of our dialogue groups with great ideas and real out-of-the-box thinking.
Well, thank you so much, Todd, for taking us through each of those. I'm going to bring in one of the members of our steering committee, Elle Gibbs. Elle, I'm wondering why this in particular is such an important moment in time for us to be trying to come up with innovative ideas around housing, why this moment in particular matters.
Thanks, Ellie. I think with the NDIS review in train, asking very specific questions around what is the future of housing for people with disability, but really importantly, how do we make sure that people have genuine choices about where and who they live with and how their supports are delivered. The review is an opportunity for us to also do things a bit differently. The way I've described the dialogue is that, you know, we've brought together people who often disagree to see if we can find areas that we can agree on. And we did. And I think that's a really interesting and exciting moment to take some ideas to the review and to the government that have been built on the expertise of people with disability and included providers and allies and got us all really on the same page, which is, as you know, Ellie, not exactly a usual thing that happens.
No, a bit of a rarity sometimes. I should acknowledge that Doogie Hurd, who is on the review committee, is actually here with us today, and I want to thank Doogie for joining us. He's a very busy man at the moment, so I appreciate that. Todd, what about this process in particular? Elle was talking about the fact that these are groups that don't usually come together, but what is it about the dialogue that was particularly unique? Do you think that meant that we've come up with some pretty unique ideas?
In my experience, disability policies usually created in silos where the providers encourage feedback to policy groups. People with disabilities also have different feedback channels to policy groups, and our allies and supporters also have feedback to give to policy groups. And then it's up to the policy groups to combine that feedback to consider what they interpret to be the policy goal. But this design is different. We're all together in the same room. We're all collaborating with different ideas. We all have the same objectives, and we all want change to a very broken system.
Yes. And Elle, it was interesting to me that there was quite a number of ideas that came back that were around information and support around, trying to navigate that complex, broken system. Did that surprise you?
No, it didn't surprise me, but I think some of the solutions are really innovative and quite focused on particular aspects of housing that often get ignored when we talk about the NDIS, such as private rental. So we'll talk a bit more about that later. But the review has heard a lot about how complex the NDIS is for people with disability and their families, and how we need to solve that problem to make the NDIS work better for all of us, and how important it is for people with disability to have independent information about what is good support, where do they find it, and what do they do when things go wrong.
Yeah. And Terry Simons, you were on our steering committee. Before I throw to you, can I encourage people to join in on the chat? Is this silo way of creating policy something you're all familiar with? Is this something that you experience in your roles? Do you think it's a better process to be working collaboratively together? Or, how have you had your best policy making experiences? Because I'm interested, Terry, this is a new way of doing things. From a provider perspective, how did you find it?
Yeah, thanks very much, Ellie. Terry Simons from Uralla in Victoria. All of the above. So yes, it's my experience that providers and advocates and other people with disability, housing providers, etc., all have their own perspectives and valid interests to prosecute with government. But speaking as a provider who's a member of the Alliance 20, a group of providers around the country, and a member of National Disability Services, a peak representing a lot of providers around the country, I think our feeling in the Alliance was that our voice has to be channeled in support of the voice of people with disability around each of the policy issues, and that our collective impact would be a lot greater if we work as providers to find that common ground that Elle was referring to earlier on, and lend our resources and voice to the voice of people with disability in promoting those agreed positions to government. It doesn't change the fact that providers are still going to have their own issues around price and funding policy and a whole range of stuff to raise with government. But the higher ground here, I think, is to get behind the interests of the people with disability in the country, and providers in the Alliance 20 recognised that and agreed, and Peter was there at the first meeting as well, that we would reach out to advocacy bodies like those represented in this room and see if we could find a process to develop some of those positions, and housing was selected as the first of those to really test whether it's possible. And I agree with Elle, we have found agreement, increased trust, a process to work through those things. And I look forward to beyond this paper and this process, lending the same process and voices to other issues as well.
All right, thanks, Terry. I'm wondering if I could put Doogie on the spot, if he would forgive me, old friend, old comrade, and I'm just interested in hearing what the review has heard so far on housing, and whether this kind of process of all parts of the sector coming together is a helpful thing for the review, and what the review is looking for in its last couple of weeks, what scale of ideas you're looking for. If Doogie, you're happy to say a few words.
Well, thank you very much, Ellie. I'm always happy to be put on the spot by you and my colleagues in the sector. I'm speaking from Ngunnawal country, and I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging leaders. As you can see from my background, Ngunnawal country is, in fact, since colonisation, Canberra, and that's why that very stupid Telstra tower, which doesn't do telecommunications work, is in my background. I'm a member of the NDIS Independent Review Panel. It is fantastic to see this initiative coming to public fruition. It's very impressive to see so many people on this Zoom this morning. So congratulations to the organisers, simply fantastic. And I think it gives a very immediate and graphic indication of how important housing is for people with disability and their families. Throughout the review, housing has recurred again and again and again in submissions and comments and the meetings that have been held around the country, involving thousands and thousands of participants in hundreds of meetings, individual consultations, meetings with DRCOs and other representative organisations. Housing is a key feature of reform. We need good ideas for the future. We need housing that is based upon people's need, not just to be housed, because, you know, Maslow's hierarchy tells us that we all need housing. We need housing because we need to belong to people, to families, to friends, to communities, to Australia. And where we live, how we live, with whom we live, and having choice and control over those matters in our lives is critically important. The review is 7-8 months in. 25th of August this month, we're closing the opportunity to respond to our What We Have Heard document that was produced about a month ago. Since it was published, we've had over 400 responses. I've participated in meetings since then with some of the people who are on this call today about housing. And so it is just a bedrock foundational question to be asked and answered. And nobody who knows me would be in any way surprised for me to hear me say the answers to these questions need to be driven by the lived experience of people with disability. That's where the solutions will be found. And the last thing I would want to say is just simply this. I think it's critically important, not just because we all believe it's important, because we all live somewhere. I think it's important because I guess that most members of the Australian community think everything's hunky-dory, that we look after people with disability. They must be all right. They must live somewhere. And many people will not have a proper idea of the things, Ellie, that you, Elle, Todd have talked about already this morning. And to be able to send the message through this meeting to the Minister and to the wider community of Australians who probably want to do the right thing but don't even know there's a problem, we need to get that message across. So thank you for the invitation to be here. I'm both surprised, but to be speaking, but that doesn't matter because you know me, I'll speak to an empty room with a microphone in it. And
Yeah, I really appreciate.
congratulations on a wonderful initiative.
Thank you. Thank you for speaking. And I am pleased to say that the Minister has now joined us, Minister for the NDIS, Bill Shorten. I understand you've now joined us. Thank you so much for being here. Are you here, Minister? We're now, I understand he's here. Maybe his microphone is still off.
Sorry, I can see you, I can hear you. I listened to Doogie tell us the big secret that he will speak to an empty room with a microphone.
Yes, we didn't know that, did we? Well, Minister, we're about to present the ideas that the dialogue has come up with, and then maybe at the end we'll get you to respond once you've heard the ideas, if that's okay with you. All right, great.
Thank you.
Well, first of all, I'd like to call on Maeve Kennedy from Inclusion Australia to discuss the idea for a disability-led community organisation. Maeve.
Thank you very much, Ellie. Thanks for having me here today. I'm joining from Wurundjeri land. So my colleagues were involved in the People with Disability group, and I'm delighted to be reporting back to you about the idea for a community-led community organisation, consumer organisation. A key theme in our group was the reality of choice and control for people with disabilities when it comes to housing. In reality, that seldom exists. The truth for many people is that there is little or no choice. There's also not enough independent information people can use to make choices about where to live. This is a particular issue for people with an intellectual disability, whom Inclusion Australia represents, who are more likely to live in group homes. Brooke and Luke, our colleagues, our policy officers at Inclusion Australia, spoke strongly in this group about the need for support for people to make decisions about where they live. This is something that many people with an intellectual disability need. The group agreed that we need independent, accessible information to exercise choice and control. This will build on existing resources and initiatives, many designed by people with disability, about housing choices. This would also include development of an independent disability-led consumer advocacy approach to give people with disabilities the information and support they need to explore and manage home and living support in their NDIS plans. This includes developing and advising supported decision-making processes in relation to home and living support, providing independent information training and peer support to build the capacity of people with intellectual disability and their families to use their NDIS plans more flexibly in relation to home and living supports. It would also include technical consumer advocacy and advice, as well as systemic advocacy recommendations for change, and would develop a disability-led platform of consumer ratings and intelligence about services and supports, including choice-style mystery shopper projects.
Wonderful. Thank you, Maeve. Elle, I'm interested in just hearing about your thoughts on this one. A consumer-led body looking out for people with disability sounds pretty good to me. What do you think?
I think we're used to ideas around consumer bodies. We have them in superannuation and in electricity, but somehow in the NDIS, there isn't anyone. So I think this is a great idea to tackle consumer law, but also that particular missing piece around information. And kind of we look at ratings for lots of different things. So why wouldn't we do that for housing and for housing providers? But also to tell people with disability what kind of options people have, because I think still far too many people are presented with this is your only option around where you live and who you live with. And so this would be about really leaning into, what does choice and control really mean in practice?
And I understand there's a comment in the chat from Trudy Joyce who says regional, rural and remote have limited access to information, let alone choice. You'd agree with that, Elle?
I would. I live in a regional area and I think that is a huge idea. So Alicia has also commented that the Housing Hub has doing some of this, and we absolutely agree. This would build on existing resources that are being developed, including some that have been developed through the Information Linkages and Capacity Building Program. But some of these have been short term. And so this would be about bringing some kind of national focus to it and a bit more funding, dare I say.
And also updating those resources that might fall out of date, right, Elle? Like there's been some great programs that have given people information on housing, but they fall out of date because the funding was for a short-term project. And, you know, is that correct? That's my understanding of what some of these problems have been.
Definitely. And that's certainly what the research has found. As we're talking, you know, with the review about Tier 2, I know that's something Minister Shorten has focused on, what supports exist outside the NDIS. And so I think it is incredibly important that we make sure that there is information and that it is long-standing.
Well, sign me up to be a mystery shopper because I'm ready to go. I'm incognito, right? I blend in. So thank you so much to Maeve and to Elle there. I'm actually going to pass over to Elle Gibbs again from Dana to talk us through our second big idea, which came from the group of people with disability, which I think is my favorite idea, Elle. It's the Rental and Home Support Navigator. Handing over to you.
Thanks so much, Ellie. And I'm coming to you from beautiful Wiradjuri country. So this idea, again, came from people with disability, and it's something that both Brooke and Luke talked about in the group, as Maeve said, and lots of people talked about the need for support around private rental and making sure that people had what they needed. So we're proposing an independent, not-for-profit, disability-led body to work with people with disability to navigate the rental, housing and support ecosystem, both for those of us who use the NDIS and those outside. The organisation would become a trusted one-stop shop to advise people with disability on accessing appropriate housing services and supports. It would also advocate and build greater market power for people with disability by giving them the tools to combine their purchasing power to secure better deals, particularly around home modifications. This organisation would also liaise with and build on existing resources and groups who are working on housing. And it would advocate critically for the policy settings that would make sure that accessibility standards and improvements in rental properties would ensure more people with disability can live in the community. So the key roles of this rental and home support navigator would include identifying accessible rentals and giving advice on residential modifications, working with other tenancy organisations to improve accessibility standards for private, public and social rental properties, support and advice in rental applications, including for references and bonds. This was a particular issue that came directly from the people with disability group, specialised maintenance and property management services, and potentially bulk purchasing materials for home improvements that meet the accessibility standards and modifications where applicable.
As I said, Elle, I absolutely love this idea. And, you know, Minister Shorten talks about the NDIS needing to not be the only lifeboat in the desert. We need to keep people with disability in the rental market and not just using specialised disability housing. But the rental market needs to become a lot more accessible. One of the points that came out of the dialogue was the hard time in getting referees and raising bonds. How could a navigator assist with that?
Yeah, so this came directly from the expertise of people with disability who lived in different kinds of supported housing and often would try to move into the private rental market, but find that they couldn't get a reference or a bond. And so it was actually thought that this navigator could play a critical role in both providing a reference and supporting people and linking them with existing bond support services.
Yeah, so really linking in with those mainstream services that already exist outside of the NDIS, which is something that hasn't been happening as much as it should be. How important is it to raise accessibility standards? One of the points that came out of the dialogues was the poor standards that were funneling more people into specialist housing because of the poor standards of rental housing.
This is a very key issue, and it is a big barrier for people without disability to move into mainstream housing. So we know that the National Construction Code has come in recently that is mandating a very small amount of, minimum standards around accessibility. But we're seeing pushback in some states from the building lobby, and we've got 2 states, New South Wales and West Australia, who still haven't signed on to the Construction Code. So we really need that as a minimum, but we need to actually go further and make sure that people can do things like make modifications. I've had modifications refused by my landlord when I was a tenant, and it is really hard. We know that people are getting evicted for actually trying to get modifications that they need. So we need a better inclusivity around accessibility, because, people with disability, there's quite a few of us out there.
Yeah, absolutely. And we make great tenants. But we have a question here in the chat from Caitlin Blythe. Is there going to be any discussion of the National Rental Affordability Scheme and why that has been discontinued?
It's such a good question from Caitlin. The National Rental Affordability Scheme put a significant amount of new, accessible and affordable housing into the private rental market, but it hasn't been continued. And we didn't talk about it at the dialogue, but I think it's something that really needs to be addressed, because there are lots of people with disability whose housing is about to get an awful lot more expensive. And that is going to add to the existing levels of crisis in the housing market.
All right, thanks so much, Elle. We're on to our third idea that we want to take forward, which is around shared equity fund, which Todd is going to take us through. Todd, give us the pitch.
Thanks, Ellie. One of the key challenges we found in the discussion paper and in our consultation was we have enormous economic barriers as a person with a disability. We know community-wide, regardless of whether you have a disability or not, that the so-called Australian dream of owning one's own home is very hard to achieve. But if you're a person with a disability, it's even harder, because there are so many barriers to economic independence. So this idea is all about getting people with disabilities, getting a foothold into the property market by using the assets that we have to our advantage. We have stable incomes regardless of whether we're on the disability support pension or not. We are consistent tenants who tend to stay in the same properties for longer than your average person. We have enormous support mechanisms that can be utilised to bring some financial power to creating these shared equity models. But it's a matter of getting everybody on the same page. I'm sure Minister Shorten will talk about how we are encouraging people to have long-term security in our housing, but we need to get people with disabilities on the same page. That involves getting together with not only people within the NDIA, the National Disability Insurance Agency, and advocacy groups, but also financial institutions, so we can create a program where people with disabilities can get their foot in the door to create more economic independence, thereby reducing the reliance on some supports delivered through the NDIS and in the broader social housing models.
All right, thanks, Todd. I want to know from you, Todd, what are some of the barriers you've faced in finding the right home? What would ownership mean to you?
Ownership would mean to me stability, economic security. If you're a person with a disability, you're not taken seriously as an economic participant. You can't fully extend your choice and control. And one of the problems with the housing system at the moment, within the NDIS and without the NDIS, is you can be an NDIS participant in every part of the scheme, except in housing policy, where choice and control isn't fully extended. Having that economic independence, having that foot in the door, is the ultimate expression of choice and control, not just within the NDIS, but people with disabilities generally.
Thanks, Todd. I really appreciate that. And we're going to move on because we're running out of time to our fourth and final idea we're taking forward in this disability dialogue, which is the Disability Housing Land Bank, which Daniel Kiraku from Achieve will now take us through. Daniel?
One of the major barriers to providing best practice housing and barriers to the success of the SDA market has been the availability of land. We all know that state governments have large swathes of land in the form of traditional group homes right across a number of states. Many of these houses are run down and no longer fit for purpose and far from best practice models. The current tradition has been that eventually those houses get so run down that the participants exit them. State governments then sell off that land, and the use of those homes for people with disability or for more contemporary models in, often inner city or in more desirable suburbs, leaves the market. And we've seen more and more people with disability forced into housing on the outskirts of cities, where that's the only place where the market can function under the current SDA model. What the dialogue is proposing is a deliberate partnership between the federal government and state governments to effectively establish a disability housing land bank. To use that, what we propose is the current stock of disability assets, particularly group homes, be redeveloped into newer models of housing that could house people with disability, particularly people with complex sets of needs, but also incorporate other social housing models. So that you use that land to increase the total amount of community housing while also providing more inclusive, better designed and more fit for purpose disability accommodation. We think it is really important that the net stock of disability housing be maintained in each LGA. I think that where we know that people with disability are currently living, that they have the capacity, and future people have the capacity to live in those same suburbs and access fit for purpose, well-designed disability homes. We know that there is an outcome here where you end up with more disability housing, but also more social housing, because many of these houses sit on large quarter-acre blocks and are the old traditional 4 and 5 bedroom group homes that are no longer fit for purpose. Even this week, and I think it was really brought into clear view this week when we read in the paper that the Macquarie Hospital site was one of the sites listed as a possible area for redevelopment by the New South Wales government. Right now, there are 10 5-bedroom group homes on the Macquarie Hospital site. There are a further 10 homes used for people with psychiatric disabilities across that land. None of those are fit for purpose. None of those are contemporarily designed. But that opens up a great opportunity to think about how those large tracts of land can be used to create new models and new opportunities for people with disability to be engaged in vibrant communities and live where they have strong community networks, but do so in homes that are better and fit for purpose. I think this is a really big opportunity for government. I think it's an opportunity where states and the Commonwealth can partner on a win-win set of outcomes for people with disability and for the broader community. Because I think there's opportunity to open up much of that land for shared models of community or low-cost housing and disability housing. So we think there's a real opportunity for a cost-benefit analysis piece and a real opportunity for innovation. We also want to stress, we know that a bunch of these assets underlying sit on the state government books, and we don't necessarily think that has to change. We're not necessarily talking about the privatisation of this land, but just the redevelopment of it for better and fit for purpose uses. So I think that's the proposal, in short.
Thanks, Daniel. I guess I'm interested in knowing what's the next step to this idea.
I think we need to bring together experts in public housing, but also experts from Treasury and government at a federal and state level to come together to look at how this kind of innovation could happen. This isn't a new idea. I know in New South Wales, this very concept has been kicked around in different forms for over 2 decades. What I don't think there's ever been is a drive or an impetus to really get down and get a set of policy outcomes designed that meet everybody's needs. One of the big opportunities at the moment is every government is talking about the need for more public housing. What no governments have is necessarily large tracts of land in a whole bunch of suburbs to work on that. So I think there is a political benefit that could benefit people with disability, but it could also benefit the broad community. So I think we've got a real opportunity now, if we can get the right people in the room, to kind of dive into how it can get done.
Now, you might have answered my next question in that question, but I was going to ask, is there one particular state that we should focus on? Is the fact that it's been talked about in New South Wales for so long mean that New South Wales is first for the picking, or is there another state where we should focus our attention?
That's a really great question. I know New South Wales and Victoria's housing model is very similar when it comes to disability housing. Both state governments own large amounts of traditional 5-bedroom group homes, own lots of land that were previously used for government-run institutions. And so both of those states, or one of those states, certainly would be the primary place to start. And I know that given that the New South Wales government is really focused on housing as an agenda item for them, maybe that could be a really good place to start. But one of those two jurisdictions would make the most sense. I don't know enough about the state government housing structures in other jurisdictions to answer, but I know in New South Wales and Victoria, there's a real opportunity.
So look out, Rose Jackson.
Yeah, that's right.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Daniel. Now, there were a couple of ideas that were genuinely embraced by the groups, but we determined needed some further work before we bring them forward. I'd like to invite Terry Simons from the CEO of Euraula to talk us through the ideas and what further thinking is required here. Terry, do you maybe just want to give us a quick idea of these ideas that didn't quite make the cut, but had some real merit to them?
Yeah, thanks, Ellie. And I'm coming to you from Wurundjeri country in Naarm in Melbourne. The two ideas here are really interlinked, and in a way, the previous conversations have set these up nicely by getting into some big issues like land availability. The first one is really about market coordination and market stewardship. The NDIS review noted that the competition in the NDIS has not produced improved quality, innovation, or diversity of services for all participants in all locations. And I think Minister Shorten's made the same point a number of times as well, that price and competition are not the only levers. And housing is a great example, and Daniel made this comment as well, of where all levels of government and various sectors, some of whom are represented in this conversation today, need to be working together. It's been a great step forward over the last 12 months. There was a National Housing Accord released last year, substantial additional investment from the Commonwealth Government. I'd like to say it was precision driving, but I suspect it was an accident. We have a National Cabinet meeting tomorrow focused on housing as well. So I think all governments are very engaged in this issue. There's a couple of things that are needed, I think. Disability is kind of strangely a bit absent from some of the policy documents, and maybe there's an assumption that the NDIS and specialist disability accommodation has got disability sorted. That's not the case. There are probably 10 times more people with disability accessing Commonwealth rental assistance to navigate the private rental market than there are accessing SDA. So as Elle and others have said, we need to have a bigger picture view here. And I think the engagement of National Cabinet and all states, territories and the Commonwealth is a great opportunity. The other thing missing, of course, from that is also disabled leadership. And that's the point our document makes, is people with disability have to be in that conversation, working with housing providers, specialist disability providers and government to help navigate and design the market. Related to this is another idea that was sort of considered around an innovation hub. And I think innovation really falls out of that market stewardship role. Innovation is required. Somebody made the comment earlier in the chat that we can't have models imposed upon everyone in a kind of one size fits all. But I do think the Mind and Haven models are interesting and may work for some people, but they're not going to work for others, the same way that single occupancy apartments don't work for everybody. So we need a real appetite for innovation, and we need to stimulate providers, not just specialist disability providers, but housing providers as well, to maintain some of the innovation that's already occurred. Here in Victoria, we have a Future Homes initiative around apartment design that needs to be maintained. There are other things that need to be done. And that innovation, I think, will help us come up with a market that can meet a range of needs. So the two ideas really are kind of a bit of a pigeon pair around better stewardship of the market, something which the NDIS review has already called for in relation to a wider range of disability supports, and coming out of that market stewardship, and appetite and funding for innovation.
Thanks, Terry. I guess, how would you like to see these ideas further developed, and so that they are, I guess, a little bit more mature and ready to go?
I think it requires an appetite for risk among the various funding bodies, including the NDIA. Alicia made a reference in the chat and has posted a report around alternatives for shared living. That was particularly initiated to consider the needs of people living in current group homes. The Royal Commission and others have observed how inadequate some of those homes are and the lack of choice generally for people who've ended up in those homes. So when you think about models that might work for those people, and not all of those people are going to want to live on their own in apartments, how do we come up with alternative models of shared living that might meet their needs and give them choice? The market currently isn't really set up to actually meet those needs, I think, as well as it should be. So it's both encouraging ideas and then putting some funding on the table to support some of those ideas, and also making sure they're well evaluated so that we use evidence and data and the experience of people with disability in those projects to drive further design.
Amazing. Thanks so much, Terry. I have a comment here from Bern D, who says building more appropriate housing in regional areas needs to be prioritised so that people with disability are not having to move towns and leave informal supports to be able to access housing that meets their choices and needs. Elle, as someone who lives in regional Australia, would you agree that that's something that you've seen happening?
Absolutely. There is some new SDA housing going up in my town, and it's a really welcome thing because people have had to move far away from their supports, from their family, from the people and communities that they know in terms of trying to find accessible housing. So it's really important that we make sure that when we talk about choice and control, that we also include that people can stay in the communities that they love.
Absolutely. Well, you've heard our 4 ideas, and we are really keen to get a response from the Minister. Minister Shorten, what do you think of our big 4 ideas? What are your reflections?
First of all, thank you, everybody. I'm impressed by the breadth and the ambition of the ideas. And obviously, we'll take them on board and have a listen, and the dialogue will continue. It does make me realise a couple of basic truths which we all know. One truth is that we wasted 9 years where my predecessors just treated it as a payment system and no focus on the ecosystem where we go. In other words, just pay the money and not, how you can pay out billions of dollars and not pay attention to things like housing and the world that you're sending the money into. It's just frustrating, but that's gone now. So I hear people talking about risk-taking innovation. We're certainly up for innovation and risk-taking. The other basic truth, before I get to the point of some of the specific matters, is we really need to engage other departments and the states. And I really need all of you to do that with me. I don't view, maybe some of you have this view of me, but I don't have this view of you, that I don't think we're on different sides. We might have different jobs to do, but we all agree that we need to create a more mainstream inclusion approach across all departments and across the states. So the NDIS not only can't be the only lifeboat, but we've got to have a big vision of it, not just as an amoral payment system where there's no focus on workforce, no focus on housing, no focus on education, no focus on the jobs. It's just, we've got to think bigger. That's what you're doing. Again, you've crystallised some propositions. I can only stress to you that the review is underway. So we've got to make sure this dialogue's not happening in one room and the review is happening in another. You've got to take these ideas, because the review is a good vehicle, because my interest isn't really to tell people what to think. That's, you're reflecting what people think. The question I have is, how do I make things happen? How my role is to be an enabler, not a yes/no guy, but how do we enable and empower? It amazes me we don't already have proper consumer feedback on NDIS services. I mean, there are some structures. I think the new leadership of the NDIS is certainly embracing co-design and feedback more than the old. And as you know, in the most recent budget, we're securing a lot of resources to build up agency capability. But we've got to make sure that the consumers of the system can give their feedback and it can be publicly available feedback. I mean, we're not trying to invent something new with disability-led consumer organisation and feedback. These exist in other parts of our world, even down to something as basic as star ratings by people who use an Airbnb. And we really need to democratise the review of how service providers are going. And that will actually, I think, be a very empowering and qualitative process. I know that what Maeve and others are talking about is broader than that, but so I get the principle and I embrace the principle. Again, the navigator propositions that Elle was talking about shouldn't just be for housing. I think we've overcomplicated all the roles in the NDIS. We have not just planners, but we have support coordinators, we have local area coordinators, we've got plan managers, we've got auditors of service providers. I really think it's the functionalities of setting up the plan, what are the person's aspirations and hopes, and then someone to help them navigate. So I think starting in helping with rental services is pretty low hanging fruit. And I love that point that people with disability make great tenants. So I think that was pretty good what was suggested there. The shared equity fund's a big idea. You know, I intuitively see it. When the NDIS was set up, the states gave a lot of legacy stock, and I think we've got to have a reconsideration why we're designing rosters around houses that were never built for people with disability. You know, I'm not saying bulldoze them all and replace them with modern ideal housing, but I've heard of worse ideas. And just with the advantages of modular architecture, we can make it energy efficient. We can make it productive houses with the latest in digital technology, just give people more independence. So, but how we advance that, we'd have to take that on notice. We do need the states engaged and the Treasury officials, as Daniel said. Before I just go to the fourth idea of what Daniel was saying, just with the shared equity fund, that was the third idea, which Todd was raising. Yeah, I'm in favour that we spend so much on SDA, for example, that why should the profit in SDA go to for-profit services when it could go in a form of home equity ownership, so the actual person who's living there can get an equity share in the place that's being built or that's being run for them. So this is a little known story. It's not particular, it's tangential. My grandmother in England lived in public housing her whole life. She hated Margaret Thatcher, but and she still did even after I tell you what she did, but Margaret Thatcher did allow public housing tenants to buy their own houses. And she did that. She still hated Margaret Thatcher, but you know, even a stop clock can be right at least twice a day. But it's not a bad proposition to give people without an asset the opportunity to have an asset. So I very much understand the notion of shared equity, and I respect it. Sort of it appeals to my own value base. But of course, a lot of these things involve us getting people to think beyond just the NDIS. That's not me passing the buck. I want to make the NDIS with you the best it can be. But in order for it to be the best it can be, we need to start having the conversation with other departments. With National Cabinet, I think that there will be a big discussion about disability at the November National Cabinet. That doesn't mean that it shouldn't be talked about now, but this October review, and this is really where I'll finish up, Ellie, is it's important. I've got to take it to state ministers in October, but I know the Prime Minister, the Treasurer are very seized at the November meeting of National Cabinet, which we'll talk about, I imagine. I don't know the full agenda, but I imagine it could include education, health, housing, training, skills, but also NDIS. And I do worry that in the case of some state jurisdictions, that they just want to wash their hands of disability, but you can't and you shouldn't. So I see if we are trying to improve the performance of the NDIS and make it better for the people who use it, the quid pro quo would be a better contribution and support from the states, either directly through their share or indirectly through better foundational supports outside the system. So I might leave my remarks there, Ellie.
Can I ask you, Minister, and be cheeky and throw a question at you, which is, how do you think it is best that we support the efforts of trying to get the states to be more engaged on this issue and to even around housing, the states that maybe are more likely to be washing their hands and pushing this onto the NDIS? What is your recommendation about how we re-engage them and how we actually get them to come to the table on this when it seems almost like pushing up a very steep hill?
I spend a lot of time thinking about that question, as I imagine many people here do. Some states accept that they need to do more, others are in denial for whatever reason. There's absolutely no doubt that the way we will do it is we have to do it together. We have to agree on what it is that we want, and then we have to be relentless in seeking it. So I think the best way we can focus the states is by getting us all to agree on what it is we're seeking from them. But then what we have to do is do it together. This isn't, I mean, it's been easy for the states, to be fair to them. When my predecessors, when we were dishing you up, and you know, I'm not being too political, but when the feds were dishing up a Linda Reynolds or a Stuart Robert, it was easy for the, with ideas like independent assessment, it was easy for the states to metaphorically put their feet on the table and clasp their hands behind their head and say, well, why should we do any more when these misfits can't run the scheme? But as we lift our game, then all of a sudden they're going to have to engage more, which is what we've been doing. The review is a crucial vehicle that if we can get some agreed recommendations from the review, we need to then do all that we can politely and perhaps even impolitely to pressure the states, but we need to agree on what it is that we want, and then we need to agree to do it all together. Does that answer your question?
Okay. No, it does. It does. It sounds like it's all about working out what are some common themes that we can agree on and move towards.
Common claims and a united front.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you so much, Minister. We really appreciate you joining us today and for your very thorough and generous feedback. We really appreciate it.
Thanks for all of what you're doing. I enjoyed listening in the last 45 minutes. That was very interesting.
Wonderful. Everyone, thank Minister Bill Shorten virtually, and we are going to, I'm going to throw over to Elle. What did you think of that response from Minister, and where do you think we go to next, given that response?
Thanks, Ellie, and thanks, everyone. Thank you, Minister Shorten, for considering our ideas, and I think engaging with the breadth of what we have dreamt up during the dialogue, but the breadth of what our ambition for change. I think it's now on to us in terms of taking the work that we've done to both have a disability-led process in terms of people with disability, particularly people with intellectual disability, having a genuine say as part of this dialogue, and then how we take that forward in terms of what work we do together. I think it's been a real credit to both the Alliance 20 for being part of this, but for all of the people with disability and allies for stepping up. And now we have to think about how we do this, continue our working together in terms of talking with the states, the review, and the federal government.
Thank you so much. And so we will be presenting these ideas to the review and hope to see some of them reflected in the final report. We'd also like to thank the review for working with us and in the spirit in which that it is happening, and Doogie's here today and taking on board our feedback. If government is serious about co-design, then they really need to trust us, people with disability, to lead rather than turn up at meetings where the agenda has already been set by other people. Can I reflect as well on the collaborations with Alliance 20 and recognise their support for this project? We will not always have the same positions in this sector, but having a forum where we can identify common ground and build on it seems a really positive step forward. This is not the end of the dialogue. We'll be going into an evaluation of this project and seeing if we can come up with a sustainable model. Already, we know a number of other events we'll be hosting. One to put in your diary is the evening of September 11, when we'll be hosting a voice event as part of the National Day of Solidarity across the disability sector. If you want to get involved in events like this, please sign up at our Dialogue website. We hope this is only the beginning of a new era of our sector collaboration. For now, I'd like to thank the Minister for putting his valuable time into coming into this launch and allowing us to present the blueprint to him. Thank you so much, Minister Shorten. I'd also like to acknowledge our steering committee has put a lot of time and work into this terrific process. Elle Gibbs from Dana, Todd Winther, the lead researcher for the dialogue, Jamie Bannister from Inclusion Australia, Bron Morecambe from the Young People in Nursing Homes, Adrian Piskowski, Terry Simons from Uala, and David Swain from Endeavour, and the Secretariat for the dialogue, Chris Chippendale and Nelson Contactor from Alliance 20. On that note, we are now going to hit send and send the blueprint into the review so that they have it and can take it forward to government. Thank you all so much for joining us for this launch, and have a great day. Bye.
Right.